Scipione is a partner at C3 Human Factors Incorporated. She has an MSc in Human Factors and 20 years experience in Human Factors Engineering, consulting for several multidisciplinary project teams. She's done work in a variety of domains, including transportation, industry, nuclear, manufacturing, and defense. Several of the human factors projects are focused on the application of human factors to the analysis, development, design, certification, operation, and maintenance of human system interfaces. Please welcome Andrea.
Hi, everyone. So as Sean mentioned, what we'll be discussing today is a project that my colleagues and I completed on behalf of CCMTA on the identification and review of distracted driving technologies. I'll go over a bit of what Sean had mentioned, but Kelly and I, my colleague here sitting in the front, we are part of a human factors consultancy named C3 Human Factors. There's 4 of us as the core partners of the company, Kelly and myself and our 2 counterparts. And all 4 of us have about 20+ years experience in the domain of human factors. And as Sean mentioned, we do it in a variety of domains, including transportation, manufacturing, defense, nuclear, and emergency management. Our key experience or expertise domains are defining user requirements, using a user-centered design process or approach to the work that we conduct, testing, evaluation, and research, selection and training, as well as team design and teamwork. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with human factors, but what human factors is it uses a user-centered design process or approach in anything that we do. So the overall approach or the overall objective in its simplest form is, can these users complete these tasks to a required level of performance in this operational environment? So we use a user-centered design approach or process, and we consider the persons, and in terms of the person, we look at their mental and physical capabilities and limitations. We look at the task. So what kind of task is the user performing, and at what level of performance do they need to complete that task to succeed? And also we consider the impact of the environment that the task is being completed in and how that will affect their performance. In terms of the project that we completed for the CCMTA, the overall objective or primary objectives was to assist them in developing an understanding of the types of technologies that may distract, and then from the information that we gained, this is the information that they can then disseminate to their shareholders and stakeholders and committee members about issues that may potentially impact vehicle safety. So in order to achieve that overall objective, we completed 3 independent tasks. So task 1 was basically to identify the information and technology, or information and communication technologies, or ICTs, that have the potential to distract drivers. The second task was looking at any ICTs or technologies that have been designed or marketed to mitigate or eliminate distracted driving. And in terms of those 2 tasks, we looked at 4 different things. So we looked at devices installed within the vehicle, so OEM equipment. We looked at devices that can be carried and used within the vehicle. We looked at wearable technology, and we also looked at devices that can be integrated within a vehicle. And task 3 was a little bit more independent than the first 2. We developed a survey that CCMTA could then deliver to their shareholders, stakeholders, to gather information on the roles and responsibilities that are taken at the provincial and territorial levels, as well as the federal levels, in order to identify any sort of methodologies or approaches that they use in order to address distracted driving associated with technology use. So in terms of our methodology, it was basically 4-tiered. So we developed our search criteria. So we reviewed an excessive amount of literature related to distracted driving and the use of devices, as well as technologies that are used to mitigate or eliminate against distracted driving. We then defined that search criteria, so we reviewed all that literature, and then we developed criteria based on definitions of distracted driving as well as different modes of interaction. And then we developed a key set of search terms that we could use to then investigate or identify those technologies in use. We conducted our search by just doing a general internet search. We looked at literature databases that we have access to, marketing research and reports, as well as consumer reports. Then once we identified the ICT devices, we basically documented each one in a data collection table. Through that task, we identified that there's also a lot of applications, not just technologies, but applications that can be used in terms of the ICT devices implicated in distracted driving, as well as applications that are in use to mitigate against distracted driving. So we also took those into account. And then we conducted an analysis of all the devices and technologies that we found in order to categorize the type of distractions that we found. So visual, manual, or auditory that are implicated by each device. Oops. So in terms of the ICTs that distract, so when we went through our literature search and we gathered all the information and identified all the different types of devices, we first characterized them in terms of ICT types. So that would be your first column. The second column is we then looked at all those different ICT types and subcategorized them into categories. So you'll notice that for some ICT types, there's multiple categories, and those multiple categories are basically divided based on different types of modes of interaction. So for example, in terms of wearable technology, you'll have just a general smartwatch, but then you'll also have a voice-activated smartwatch. Because the number of devices that we found, it just could go on and on and on. So we did limit per ICT category a limit of 3 devices, and we did try to take a representative sample of those 3, or of the devices within those categories. So overall, we did identify 9 ICT types, 29 ICT categories. So when you look at the math, we basically identified for ICTs that distract about, I think we documented close to 90 devices. The table on the right is how we documented each of those 3 devices per category. So we just looked at primarily the mode of interaction, both input and output. We also gave a functional description, put a little picture in there, and also the type of information that the device presented to the driver. As I mentioned before, as we went through and we recognized all the different types of devices that were available, we did identify that for some devices, there's also a level of distraction or a type of distraction that's associated with the application of what the driver might be using. So it's not only that they're using, say, a smartphone, but are they texting with the smartphone? Are they talking on the smartphone, or are they using some sort of application? So we took it one step further to identify different applications that can be used with ICT devices. And in total, again, it's just a summary, but in total we identified 12 different application types, and then again put that scope of 3 different types of applications within that category. And then we did use that data collection table again, just modified slightly to describe each of those 3 applications per category that we found. It just changes slightly. We still looked at input and output. We changed it by just looking at the type of device that application could be used with. So, of course, with smartphones, smartwatches, there's a variety of applications. Some devices that we found were baby monitors that you can actually place in your vehicle. Obviously, you're not going to be using an application with that. So in terms of looking at the results or our analysis, we identified the types of distraction implicated by the devices. So we recorded the types of distraction for both input and output for each of the devices. Because, as I mentioned, there's many devices, We tried to scope it by presenting the device or presenting the results on the worst case scenario of the devices that we found, just because we tried to take a representative sample, but the analysis is based on the devices that we categorized. So we did try to take the worst case scenario. The types of distraction included visual, auditory, tactile, or any combination of these. And from a human factors perspective, we assumed that there would be a cognitive component associated with each of these types of distraction. So there is no just one independent cognitive, because with anything you're doing, there's always going to be some sort of cognitive component. We also looked at any sort of speech that was associated with the devices, and that was threefold. So it was either verbal communication, so are they making phone calls, or is it voice commands, or is it video? When we did our analysis, we did have to put several assumptions into place to conduct the analysis. So we looked at the device's intended use, so the typical usage. We did look at default settings just to make it consistent across the board. The use of device, what they would be using their device for when they're driving as opposed to in a parked position. What we focused on was obviously the information presented to us. So it was literature that we found in marketing material or reports or manufacturing information provided by OEMs. We also assessed the devices in isolation and not in combination with each other. So we didn't consider someone maybe looking at their phone and then using their GPS, for example, on their dash. It was just everything was evaluated in isolation. And we only looked at the feedback that was provided to the driver in order to make a decision. So in terms of the results for ICTs that distract, there was 3 types of distraction that were associated with driver input, and majority was associated with tactile and visual, so someone completing a manual task with that ICT device and then also viewing the display as a result of that. And tactile was only associated, or a tactile interaction was only associated with headphones or portable audio devices. And that was for input. For output, we did notice 5 types of distraction that were associated, and majority was visual and auditory. So again, ICTs usually have a display, and it's providing some sort of alert or notification or verbal speech back to the driver. And then next was tactile, visual, and auditory distractions, which was generally assessed with mobile phones, wearable technology, where they have more capabilities to complete different actions. And then in terms of speech for the ICTs that distract, all ICT types did incorporate some type of speech input by the driver, and majority incorporated voice commands and then voice communication, which is speaking in real time. Just for time's sake, I'm not going to go over the applications for ICT devices, but we did do a full analysis on that as well. To go into technologies that eliminate or mitigate against distracted driving, the same sort of methodology was applied. So again, we went through our literature search to find our terms, identified a bunch of technologies again that are marketed or specifically designed to mitigate or eliminate against distracted driving. And we came across 18 different ICT types. And again, we scoped our findings to 3 representative examples per category. Again, we made a shift in the table to document each one. So for here, we did look at input and output again, but then we also associated the type of technology to a device that it could be used with, so which IT device it could be used with. So in terms of the results for mitigation technologies, each device was reviewed to determine the type of mitigation that was designed to address while driving. So just a subset of our table. So we looked at the ICT type, looked at the 3 different devices that were listed. Across the top, all the different items that are possible with ICT devices, and then looked at that device in terms of what those devices mitigated against. So majority of the mitigation devices only do facilitate hands-free calling, followed by preventing texting and then application use. And devices such as cell control, Kairos mobile solution, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, so those types of mitigation devices do mitigate against the majority of potential driver interactions. And hands-free communication devices and just wearable technologies and paired sound systems only facilitate hands-free calling or prevent hands-free calling. So what we did notice as we went through this was that even though these devices and technologies are geared towards mitigating or eliminating distraction, they still do require some sort of driver input and output for their use. So when we looked across the board, what we identified was that about 35% of the devices and technologies that we looked at still require driver input for operation, even though they are marketed for mitigation. And majority of these devices also provide output to the driver that has a potential to distract the driver. So just to look there, so the first one is distraction in terms of input, and in terms of the mitigation devices in terms of potential for distraction for output. So there's only two for input, which were tactile only and tactile visual. And again, for output, of course, it's more across the board. It was 5 out of the potential 7. Just like the technologies that are implicated in distracted driving, we also looked at applications that can be used to mitigate against distracted driving. Each application was reviewed to determine the type of mitigation, again, that it was designed to address while driving. Oh, I skipped a slide. So here's the applications that were designed to mitigate against distracted driving. We identified 9 different types of applications, and again, we scoped it down to 3 per, and then we, again, categorized each design or characterized each design according to our data collection table. And then, as I was just mentioning, each application was then reviewed again to look at the type of mitigation or the type of interaction that it would mitigate against. So again, just a subset of our findings, just to give a brief example. So head-up Google-enabled and GPS-enabled HUD applications, they're only designed to really maintain a direct line of sight between the driver and the road. So even though it's a mitigation technology, it's mitigation in terms of them not having to look down or look to the right. It's in their field of view, and they're considering that mitigation, that they're keeping their eyes on the road instead of having to focus elsewhere. Interception, reward-based, and AT&T drive mode applications, those are designed to facilitate hand-free calls and prevent texting. And then virtual assistants and automotive applications, again, facilitate only hands-free calling. So some limitations and some of our future work that should be considered. So again, as I mentioned before, ICTs were only assessed in isolation of each other. So many ICTs do enable multiple functions that can be used simultaneously. And these need to be characterized in terms of looking at the impact of multitasking on driver distraction. The level of distraction was not assessed for our project. So we identified the different types of distraction, so whether it was visual or auditory or tactile or a combination, but we did not quantify that level of distraction per device. There has been some progress made in terms of developing some sort of approach to trying to categorize and identify that level of distraction and quantify it, but it hasn't been recognized yet as a standardized process or approach, and I don't believe it has been validated yet. So it wasn't used for our present project. But in future work, the level of distraction to move forward associated with each type of device should be represented, and then this would be associated maybe with some sort of graduation of penalties. So If law enforcement's looking that way, then they do need to quantify the level of distraction by the type of ICT that was used. And then technology, of course, is always being introduced and evolving. We did try to represent a wide range of devices and applications, but again, that list could go on and on and on. So we did scope it to 3. And as I mentioned, we did try to take a representative sample, and then we did try to do our analysis on the worst case scenario that was presented. And that is it. Thank you. Any questions?
We have time for questions, folks, if you would like to.
It's more just a general question and maybe not so much on your presentation. There's a lot of focus on obviously distraction as a result of technology, which is, I'm thinking, because of so many casualties that we've had as a result of distraction from technology. So is there any thought about more general distractions, such as dogs in the driver's seat, or eating while driving, more general distractions which can also result in casualty?
I'm assuming yes, for our project, it was just a scope on types of devices. From a human factors perspective, yes, definitely, because even for us, like from a cognitive perspective, you're talking to someone beside you in the passenger seat, you're still taking some attention away from the road and putting it elsewhere. So definitely, I'm not sure if any further research from CCMTA is looking at that, but for us, no. Any other questions?
Last chance. Okay.
Was that
thank
good,
you,
eh?
Andrea. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you.